Aurora was an elderly mother who arrived to visit her wealthy son, but upon opening the door, she discovered something that left her frozen. Dawn was just beginning to tint the fields with light when Aurora woke up, as she had done her entire life. Her small home in the countryside, with furniture worn down by time, was immersed in the same silence as always, a silence that, in recent years, had grown heavier. The morning cold seeped through the walls, but she didn't care. Aurora had something more urgent that troubled her, her son. Richard had become accustomed to her long sleepless nights, thinking about him. Time seemed to have stopped since the last time she received a call or a letter from him. 2 years had passed since his last visit. And although at first she justified his absence by the relentless pace of life in the city, doubts began to gnaw at her. Neighbors constantly asked, "And your son, Ms. Aurora? When is he coming to visit you?" Aurora always smiled and answered that Richard was very busy, but inside, the anguish grew like a shadow. While getting dressed in her best clothes, a brown wool skirt and a blouse she had saved for special occasions, Aurora made a decision she had been avoiding. She couldn't wait any longer. The nights were too long, and the silence too painful. If Richard wouldn't come to her, she would go find him. She had raised her son with her own hands, working from sunrise to sunset in the fields after her husband's death. He was everything to her. She couldn't abandon him without at least knowing the truth. Was he well? Had he found something that kept him away from his mother? Or was there something darker behind his disappearance? With a small suitcase in hand, Aurora left her house, locking the door with a knot in her throat. The trip to the city wasn't long in terms of distance, but emotionally it felt endless. She boarded the old bus that would take her to her destination, sitting in a corner as she watched the countryside landscapes fade away through the window. She remembered the times she had bid Richard farewell when he departed for the city, full of dreams and promises. He promised to return. He promised that his success would also be hers. But now, after so many years of silence, those memories filled her with overwhelming sadness. As the hours went by, the landscape changed. The vast countryside plains were replaced by gray, tall buildings that seemed to challenge the sky. The city was noisy, bustling, and completely foreign to Aurora. The car lights, the incessant traffic noise, the rush of the people, all of it made her feel small, as though she were in a place where she didn't belong. But there was no turning back. Richard was here, and she had to find him. Upon arriving at the bus station, Aurora felt overwhelmed by the number of people coming and going without even noticing her. With difficulty, she found the crumpled paper containing the address of Richard's mansion. She had kept it in her bag since the last time he wrote to her. The address was in one of the most exclusive areas of the city, a place she never imagined visiting. She took a taxi, and while the car drove her through the luxurious streets, Aurora gazed in awe at the enormous buildings and mansions passing by her window. She had never seen houses so large, so perfect. They were cold, spotless, and seemed devoid of life. She remembered Richard's promise, "Someday I'll bring you to live with me, Mom, in the city, where everything is easier, more comfortable." But Aurora never wanted to leave her life in the countryside. All she ever wanted was for her son to be happy, even if that meant being far away from her. Finally, the taxi stopped in front of an imposing mansion. The wrought iron gates and the perfectly manicured garden intimidated her. With trembling hands, she paid the driver and got out of the car, remaining in front of the door. She felt the weight of the luxury around her, as though that place were judging her. She took a deep breath and gathered her courage, ringing the doorbell. Several minutes passed, what felt like an eternity to Aurora, before the door slowly opened, revealing a young woman elegantly dressed. Her beauty was cold, and when her eyes met Aurora's, they filled with a mixture of surprise and contempt. "Yes?" the woman asked, without even trying to hide her disdain. "I'm Aurora, Richard's mother," she replied in a trembling voice. The woman's face showed no emotion, no smile, no gesture of welcome. "Richard isn't home," she said sharply. "He's very busy with his business." Aurora's disappointment and anxiety intensified, but she refused to be intimidated. She had come from afar, traveling with a broken heart to see her son, and she wouldn't leave so easily. "I've come from the countryside to see him. I can wait until he returns," she said with a calmness that didn't reflect the emotional chaos she felt. Victoria, as the woman introduced herself, looked at her with a mix of irritation and scorn. After a few seconds of awkwardness, she finally allowed her to enter, taking her to a small room by the entrance. The contrast between the mansion's opulence and Aurora's humility was striking, but it didn't affect her. She only wanted to know where her son was and why he hadn't told her anything about his new life, especially about his marriage. The wait would be long, but at that moment, Aurora was willing to do anything to see Richard again. However, the silence in the mansion was disturbing, and as Aurora settled on a sofa that seemed never to have been used, a dark feeling began to grow in her chest. Something wasn't right. She could sense it. Aurora couldn't stop looking around as she settled into the enormous, luxurious living room of the mansion. The contrast between the old furniture in her home in the countryside and the cold opulence surrounding her now was overwhelming. The walls were adorned with expensive paintings, and heavy velvet curtains fell to the floor as if concealing secrets behind them. Despite the luxury, something about that place seemed empty to her, as though the house itself lacked life. Aurora shifted uncomfortably on the leather sofa that creaked under her weight. She couldn't shake the feeling that she didn't belong there, but her love for Richard kept her firm. She had traveled so far to see him, and she wouldn't leave without answers. She looked around for signs of her son, a photo or some reminder that would confirm that this was indeed his home, but she found nothing. Not a single photo of Richard or any trace of his presence. It was as if the mansion reflected nothing of him. A few minutes passed before Victoria, Richard's wife, returned to the room. Her expression was still cold, almost detached, and she carried a cup of tea, which she placed in front of Aurora on a small coffee table. "Drink this to warm up," she said in an indifferent tone. "Thank you, dear," Aurora replied softly, hoping to break the barrier between them. "When do you think Richard will be back? I'm eager to see him." Victoria sat in a nearby chair, crossing her legs with an elegance that seemed calculated. Her eyes scanned Aurora's small, tired figure, as if evaluating every aspect of her humble appearance. "Richard is very busy lately," Victoria answered. "Business consumes all his time. Sometimes he doesn't even come home at night. He's always traveling, closing important deals. He's a very sought-after man." Aurora nodded slowly, but something in her words didn't convince her. That wasn't the Richard she knew. Her son had always been dedicated, yes, but also caring. He never would have left his mother for so long without communication, much less with the indifference Victoria was now showing. Every word she spoke seemed layered with coldness and distance, as though she were hiding something she didn't want to reveal. "When do you think I might see him?" Aurora persisted, her voice steadier than before. "I don't know," Victoria replied, standing up again. "It could be days, maybe weeks. I'm not sure of his schedule. But if you wish, you can stay here until he returns." Victoria didn't wait for a response before turning to leave, once again leaving Aurora alone in that enormous, empty room. Aurora watched her figure disappear behind a door, leaving her with the echo of her own thoughts. Time passed slowly in the mansion. The rays of light entering through the windows began to fade as the sun set, turning everything orange and golden. Seconds felt eternal as Aurora waited for some sign or news of her son. The tea Victoria had brought her had grown cold, but she didn't touch it. Her stomach was too uneasy to drink or eat anything. Hours later, Aurora started feeling even more uncomfortable. The silence in the mansion was unsettling, almost oppressive. The walls seemed to close in, and every small sound, from the creak of the wood to the distant murmur of the staff, was amplified in her mind. She knew something wasn't right. Her mother's intuition told her there was something hidden behind that coldness, something Victoria wasn't willing to tell her. The staff occasionally passed through, avoiding her gaze. They were like shadows moving quickly from one room to another, as if wanting to remain invisible. This only increased the unease in Aurora's heart. No one offered a smile or even a glance of understanding. She felt like a stranger in her own son's life. Finally, when darkness completely enveloped the house, Victoria returned to the room. This time, she didn't offer any explanation or kind words. She simply stopped at the entrance, looking at Aurora. "It's late, Miss Aurora," she said without emotion. "I'll ask Peter, our butler, to take you to a room so you can rest. It may be several days before Richard returns." Aurora stood up, nodding slowly. Though her heart was filled with uncertainty, she wanted to say something, to ask more questions, but she knew Victoria wouldn't give her any answers. Her son's wife had built an impenetrable wall around herself, and there was no way to break through it for now. The butler, Peter, appeared at the door. He was an older man with a face marked by experience and a cautious expression. He motioned for Aurora to follow him down the dim corridors of the mansion in silence. As they walked, Aurora noticed that Peter avoided making eye contact with her, but there was something in his demeanor that made her think he knew more than he let on. They reached a small room far from the center of the house. It was nothing more than a guest room, but for Aurora, it was enough. She was exhausted, both physically and emotionally. She sat on the edge of the bed, listening to the echo of Peter's footsteps receding down the hall. Silence fell over her again, an oppressive silence that weighed on her chest. Before Peter closed the door, Aurora stopped him with a question that had been on her mind since she arrived. "Excuse me, Peter, right?" she said softly. "Do you know when my son will return?" Peter hesitated, as though he didn't know if he should answer. Finally, he nodded slightly without looking at her. "Your son, Richard, is complicated, Ms. Aurora. He's busy." That was all he said, and with nothing more, he closed the door. Peter's words echoed in Aurora's mind. Something in the way he spoke left her uneasy, the same empty words Victoria had repeated, but with a tone that hinted at more. What were they hiding? Lying in the small bed, Aurora tried to close her eyes, but she couldn't sleep. Her son was somewhere, perhaps closer than she thought, but shrouded in a mystery she didn't yet understand. What was Victoria hiding? And why did no one seem willing to speak of him directly? As her thoughts wandered, Aurora realized one thing for certain. She wouldn't leave that mansion until she discovered the truth about her son. Something was wrong. She felt it in the deepest part of her heart. The first ray of sun slipped through the heavy curtains of the room as Aurora opened her eyes after a night filled with restless dreams. Emotional exhaustion weighed on her body, but she knew she couldn't stop. Even though Victoria insisted Richard was away on business, her heart told her otherwise. Something in that mansion just didn't fit, something everyone around her seemed to be hiding. She rose slowly, feeling the cold floor under her bare feet, and got dressed in the same clothes she had brought from the countryside. Once ready, she decided to go down to the dining room, hoping that maybe Victoria would finally give her some more concrete news about her son. Walking through the long corridors, the absolute silence enveloped her. She could barely hear the staff's footsteps, moving like shadows between rooms, not even directing a single word or glance at her. Upon arriving at the dining room, she found a large table empty. No sign of Victoria or any other family member, only a couple of servants going back and forth, preparing a breakfast that seemed more fitting for a feast than for the loneliness that pervaded the house. She slowly sat in one of the chairs, uncomfortable with the surrounding luxury. Still, she decided to wait. A few minutes, perhaps hours, passed, but Victoria never appeared. The mansion, despite its size, felt empty, and the sense of abandonment grew in Aurora's chest. The servants hurried about, avoiding her as if afraid she might question them, as if her presence shattered the controlled, cold routine Victoria had imposed. After finishing breakfast without even remembering what she had eaten, Aurora decided to walk around the mansion. Something compelled her to uncover what was really happening, to find any clue that would reveal where Richard was. She passed several rooms locked with keys, something that struck her as odd in such a big house. Every time she tried to approach one of the doors, a servant appeared, as if they were watching her, offering an excuse to steer her away from that area. In one of the farthest corridors of the house, near what seemed to be the staff's area, Aurora saw Peter, the butler. He was bent over, polishing an antique table. When he noticed her presence, he stopped. His eyes, filled with a mix of concern and caution, regarded her for a second too long. "Peter," Aurora called, slowly approaching. He lifted his gaze. Though uncomfortable, he didn't avoid her like the others. "Ms. Aurora," he responded in a deep voice. "Where is my son?" she asked directly, feeling she could no longer pretend everything was fine. Peter tensed, as though the question had placed him in a dangerous position. He looked around, making sure no one else was listening. "Ms. Aurora," he started, then fell silent for a moment as if struggling with the words. "It's not my place to say." Aurora realized Peter knew something important, but for some reason he couldn't speak. Yet her intuition told her he was the key to discovering what was really happening in the house. "If it's not your place, then whose is it?" Aurora replied, trying to maintain her composure. "My son is everything to me, and something tells me you're not telling me the whole truth." Peter looked away, clearly troubled by the situation. But before he could say anything else, a sound in the hallway alerted him. Victoria appeared in the doorway, her cold presence filling the space. "Is everything all right here?" she asked with a tense smile, looking from Aurora to Peter, who immediately stepped back, resuming his work without another word. Aurora felt the weight of Victoria's gaze upon her but said nothing. She knew she had to be cautious. Pressing her lips together, she bowed her head slightly and returned to the main sitting room. Later that afternoon, Aurora approached Peter again, aware that he was her only ally, even if silently so. She found him in the kitchen, sorting cutlery. This time, she made sure no one else was around. "Peter, I know you know something. I beg you, tell me the truth," Aurora implored in a hushed tone, her eyes pleading. The butler lowered his gaze but couldn't avoid answering this time. "Ms. Aurora, things in this house aren't what they seem," he whispered, his tone tense. "Your son Richard isn't traveling. He's here in the house." Aurora's heart pounded. Richard was in the house the whole time? Why had Victoria lied? Before she could ask anything else, Peter continued, dropping his voice even lower. "Richard had an accident months ago. A very serious accident. Since then, Victoria doesn't let anyone see him. She keeps him hidden. I can't say more, Ms. Aurora, but you have the right to know. Just be careful, Victoria isn't who she appears to be." Aurora's heart seized in her chest as she tried to process what she had just heard. Richard was in that mansion, perhaps close by, and she hadn't even known. What sort of accident had he suffered, and why was Victoria hiding him? Before she could ask more questions, Peter hurried away, leaving Aurora alone in the kitchen with the weight of her new suspicions. That night, in her room, Aurora couldn't stop thinking about what she had discovered. Something terrible was happening in that house, and now she knew it for certain. Victoria had lied to her from the start. Her son, her beloved Richard, was there somewhere, kept prisoner in some way. Intrigue and fear consumed her, but one thing was clear: she wouldn't leave that mansion until she found out exactly what had happened to her son and why his own wife was keeping him away from the world. Aurora promised herself that she would uncover the truth, no matter the cost. That night, Aurora barely slept. The whispers of shadows seemed to echo through the mansion's hallways, blending with her own thoughts. She knew Richard was there, so close yet so far, hidden by Victoria's coldness. Peter's words stayed in her mind: Richard is in the house. But why wasn't anyone speaking of him? What kind of accident had left him locked away, invisible to the world? Anxiety and fear wouldn't let her remain still. The mansion's silence became more oppressive than ever, and the feeling that something was wrong gnawed at her from the inside. She rose from the bed, determined to act. She knew Victoria wouldn't tell her anything more, and the few clues she had gotten from Peter weren't enough. She had to find the truth on her own, even if it meant risking the unknown. Barefoot and moving cautiously, she left her room and made her way through the mansion's corridors, which were barely lit by faint lamp lights. Her breathing quickened with each step, and the echo of her footsteps seemed to resound everywhere, as though the entire place was watching her. The elongated shadows of the furniture appeared to shift around her, and Aurora felt a chill run down her spine. She passed several locked doors, remembering how, in previous days, she had noticed that many of the rooms were firmly secured. She stopped in front of one such door, large, made of wood, with a heavy lock. Something inside her whispered that behind that door lay part of the truth she was desperately seeking. She tried turning the handle, but it was locked. Like so many others. Just as she was about to turn away, she heard a sound, a faint murmur, almost imperceptible, coming from behind the door. Aurora held her breath and pressed her ear to the wood. She couldn't make out words, but the sound was unmistakable. Someone was talking, and it wasn't a monologue. It sounded like a conversation. Fear mixed with curiosity. Who was in there? Could it be Richard? Aurora took a step back, her heart pounding. She couldn't open the door, but this confirmed her suspicions. Something was happening behind those locked walls. Before she could move, a figure appeared at the end of the hallway. It was Peter, the butler. Upon seeing her there, he visibly tensed and walked toward her, his steps silent, as if he were trying not to alert anyone else in the house. "Ms. Aurora," he whispered, "you can't be here. Victoria mustn't find out." Aurora looked at him, her eyes reflecting the urgency of a desperate mother searching for the truth. "Peter, please tell me the truth," she whispered urgently. "My son is here, right? You can't keep hiding what's happening. Something is very wrong. I feel it." Peter looked nervously in both directions of the hallway before stepping even closer to Aurora. His eyes were filled with worry and compassion. "You're right. Richard is here," he said gravely. "But not how you expect. He suffered an accident. At least, that's what we're all supposed to believe." Aurora felt a knot forming in her throat. "What kind of accident?" she asked, her voice trembling. Peter swallowed hard, clearly anxious about what he was about to reveal. "No one knows for sure what happened. Victoria told us Richard had a fall, but the staff rumors, they say it wasn't an accident. What is certain is that since then, Richard hasn't been the same. He's bedridden, very ill. They keep him locked up in a room in the far wing of the house, and only Victoria and a select few have access to him." Aurora felt as though the ground was disappearing beneath her. "Why are they hiding him?" she asked, her voice choked with anguish. "I don't know for sure," Peter answered, looking down. "But many of us believe it wasn't just an accident. Victoria, she's changed many things since Richard fell ill. She's taken complete control of the business. She hardly lets anyone visit him. Even the nurse who cares for him is under her strict watch. The entire house has become Richard's prison." A whirlwind of emotions swept through Aurora. Pain, anger, fear. Her son, her beloved Richard, was being held prisoner in his own home, under the control of his wife, and no one was doing anything to help him. "I have to see him," Aurora said, clenching her fists. "I have to see my son." Peter looked at her sadly. "It's not that simple. Victoria keeps watch everywhere. She doesn't let anyone near Richard without her permission. But there might be someone who can help you." Aurora raised her eyes hopefully. "Who?" she asked. "The nurse who cares for him. Her name is Sarah. She's the only one who's seen him since he got sick. If you can talk to her, maybe she can tell you more." Aurora nodded, feeling a spark of hope light up her soul. Now she had a name, a possible ally. But she also knew any wrong move could endanger not only Richard's health but also Sarah's and her own life. Peter gently took her arm and guided her to the back of the house, where there was a small garden hidden by the mansion's tall walls. "You can't go directly," he warned. "Wait for the right moment. Victoria leaves the house at certain times to tend to business. When she's out, I'll find a way for you to talk to Sarah. But please, Ms. Aurora, be careful. None of us are safe here." Aurora nodded, her face set with determination. The cool night air in the garden brushed her face, giving her a moment of clarity. She knew the puzzle pieces were beginning to fit together, but she also understood that confronting Victoria would be a challenge fraught with danger. Back in her room, Aurora lay down on the bed, her mind in constant turmoil. Richard was there in the mansion, and she wouldn't stop until she freed him. Now she knew she wasn't alone in this fight. Sarah and Peter were the keys to uncovering the truth and saving her son from a house that, despite its luxurious exterior, harbored dark secrets within. The night felt even longer now, but this time, Aurora didn't feel the same emptiness. She knew what she had to do, and nothing and no one would stop her. The sun was beginning to peek over the horizon when Aurora woke up, her thoughts still clouded by what she had discovered the night before. She knew the situation in the mansion was much darker than Victoria had let on, and that her son was caught in the middle of a plot she still couldn't fully understand. But the cold, calculating look in Victoria's eyes and Peter's fearful tone made it clear that nothing happening there was accidental. She waited for the right moment, just as Peter had promised. Early in the morning, Victoria left the mansion to take care of some business. Aurora felt that this was the moment she had been waiting for. Her heart pounded as she walked through the hallways toward the area where Peter said she'd find Sarah, the young nurse taking care of Richard. Finally, she arrived at a discreet door, almost hidden at the end of a long corridor. She took a deep breath before gently knocking, her hand trembling with tension. After a few seconds that felt like an eternity, the door opened, revealing a young woman with a tired but kind face. It was Sarah. "You're Richard's mother?" Sarah asked in a whisper, as if she already knew who Aurora was, even though they had never met. Aurora nodded, her throat tightening with pent-up emotion. "I need to know the truth about my son," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "Please, tell me what's happening to him. What happened?" Sarah looked around nervously, making sure no one was listening. Then, with a quick gesture, she motioned Aurora inside. Once inside, she closed the door carefully, then turned to her, eyes filled with concern. "Ms. Aurora, there are many things I shouldn't tell you, but you have the right to know," Sarah began, her voice barely audible. "Your son is gravely ill, and not just because of the accident Victoria mentions. I can't prove it, but I suspect Richard has been slowly poisoned." Aurora's world came to a halt at that moment. Sarah's words fell like a sharp blow to her heart. "Poisoned?" Aurora whispered, unable to grasp it. "How is that possible? Who could do something like that?" Sarah took a deep breath before continuing. "Victoria. She controls everything that happens in this house. Since Richard's accident, no one else has had direct access to his care except me and a few people under her command. The symptoms he's showing aren't consistent with a mere fall. The weakness, vomiting, loss of mobility, it all points to him having ingested something that has slowly weakened him. I don't have concrete proof, but every time he shows signs of improvement, he suddenly worsens right after one of Victoria's visits." Aurora felt an icy rage growing inside her. How could Victoria do something so monstrous? Her son, her dear Richard, was being destroyed from within by the person he trusted most. "This can't be," she said, struggling to hold back tears. "Why would she do this? What would she gain by hurting him?" Sarah looked at her sadly. "Control. Ever since Richard fell ill, Victoria has taken over all the business dealings. She's made suspicious financial moves, and her brother, Daniel, is involved too. Everything points to them gradually draining Richard's accounts, taking over his assets. If Richard dies, Victoria will inherit everything." Sarah's words sank deep into Aurora. It was all starting to make sense. Victoria's coldness, the silence in the house, the evasive looks from the staff. It was a conspiracy, a meticulously calculated plan to rob Richard not only of his life but of everything he had built through hard work. Meanwhile, he lay confined to his bed, slowly being consumed. We have to do something. We have to get him out of here, Aurora insisted, her voice filled with desperation. Sarah nodded. I know, but it won't be easy. Victoria has everything under her control. Every medication Richard receives goes through her first, and she has doctors under her thumb. I've tried changing his treatment, but every time I attempt something different, Victoria finds out. I don't know how much longer I can keep helping him without her noticing. Aurora felt an even greater fear for her son's life, but she knew they couldn't sit by. They had to come up with a plan, and fast. They needed evidence, something they could take to the authorities to expose Victoria's actions. Without proof, they'd stand no chance. Is there any way to get proof of what they're doing to him? Aurora asked, her gaze fixed on Sarah. The young nurse nodded cautiously. I've been collecting samples of the medications Victoria gives Richard, and I think I can get a trusted doctor to analyze them. But it will take time, and it's risky. If Victoria discovers what we're doing, she might make things worse for Richard. Aurora knew time wasn't on their side, but she also understood that without proof, they had no chance. Victoria and Daniel were dangerous, and one misstep could put not only Richard's life in danger, but also Sarah's and Aurora's own. You have to do it, Sarah. It's our only option, Aurora said, taking the young woman's hands with desperate urgency. Please, we must save my son. Sarah agreed, determination in her eyes. I'll do it, but you must also be careful. Victoria isn't stupid. If she suspects we're plotting something, she won't hesitate to act. What we're doing is extremely dangerous. Aurora knew it. Danger hovered over her like a constant shadow. But the love she felt for her son was stronger than any fear. It didn't matter what she had to do or how risky it was, she wouldn't rest until she saw Richard out of danger. While Sarah began collecting the samples and preparing her plan to have them analyzed, Aurora remained alone in the small room, her thoughts swirling. On one hand, she was terrified of what Victoria might do if she discovered their plan. On the other hand, a growing fury and determination kept her going. She knew they couldn't give up. They couldn't let Victoria and Daniel succeed in their sinister plan. As Aurora left the room, she encountered Peter in the hallway. Though he kept his usual cautious demeanor, his eyes reflected some relief upon seeing her. You found out? He asked quietly. Aurora nodded. Richard is being poisoned. Victoria is killing him slowly. Peter closed his eyes for a moment, as if what he had just heard confirmed his suspicions. Then he looked at Aurora with resolve. I'll help you however I can. We can't let Victoria get away with this. Aurora agreed. Now, more than ever, she needed allies. Peter and Sarah would be her pillars in this fight. Time was running out, but at least she now had a plan, and, most importantly, hope. As night came and the air outside darkened the mansion's walls, Aurora vowed she would not leave without her son. She understood now that behind the cold facade of that house lurked monstrous cruelty, and she was ready to do whatever it took to stop it. The days passed slowly at the mansion, each one filled with a silent tension. Aurora felt the weight of uncertainty pressing down on her more and more as she waited for the moment when Sarah could obtain proof of Richard's poisoning. She couldn't afford a single mistake or act rashly. The threat posed by Victoria and Daniel was greater than she had imagined. During the day, Aurora spent most of her time wandering the corridors of the house, watching Victoria's and the staff's movements closely. However, Richard's wife seemed busier than ever, always on the phone or out of the house on business. Though she maintained her facade of elegance and control, Aurora sensed a growing coldness and contempt each time Victoria crossed a room without even deigning to look at her. Meanwhile, Peter remained her only ally among the mansion's staff. He kept Aurora informed about Victoria and Daniel's movements, while Sarah did everything possible to keep Richard stable and gather the adulterated medication samples. Aurora knew the samples wouldn't be enough to save her son. They also needed to unearth Victoria's past, something that could completely expose her dark intentions. One afternoon, as a gray sky threatened rain, Aurora decided to investigate on her own. She knew there had to be more clues somewhere in that mansion about Victoria's true identity and her secret plans. Peter had warned her about Victoria's and Daniel's offices, located in one of the most remote rooms in the house, 2 rooms that were always locked. In a gesture of loyalty and desperation, he had given Aurora a copy of the keys. Her heart pounding, Aurora approached Victoria's office door. The mansion was unusually quiet, and she knew Victoria and Daniel had left to attend an important meeting in the city. This was the moment she'd been waiting for. The key turned in the lock with a soft click, and Aurora pushed the door open. The office perfectly reflected Victoria's personality, impeccably cold, with no trace of human warmth. Dark mahogany furniture and expensive paintings on the walls spoke of power and control. Aurora walked to the desk, where several documents lay neatly stacked. She knew she had to act quickly but also carefully. Her hands trembled as she shuffled through the papers, searching for anything that might offer a clue about Victoria's darkest secrets. Business contracts, financial agreements, everything seemed in order. But then, at the bottom of a drawer, she found something that made her freeze. It was a personal file with Victoria's name printed in gold letters. She opened it with trembling hands. Inside was a series of letters and documents unveiling a past Victoria had carefully hidden. The letters were correspondence from her 2 previous marriages, and as Aurora read, a clear picture formed in her mind. Victoria had been the widow of 2 wealthy men before marrying Richard. Both marriages had ended in tragedy. The 2 men died under suspicious circumstances shortly after signing documents naming her the heir to their fortunes. One of the older letters, written by the brother of one of the deceased husbands, described how he had tried to investigate his brother's death, but all his efforts had been thwarted. Victoria had taken steps to silence the media and anyone who dared question the official version of the accident. Aurora felt a sense of disgust and horror wash over her, realizing that Victoria had repeated this pattern again and again. Marry wealthy men, manipulate them, and dispose of them to inherit their fortunes. Her dear son, Richard, was the next victim in this chain of betrayals and deaths. She clenched her fists, anger and pain battling to overwhelm her. But she knew she had to stay strong and focused. This information was crucial, but it might not be enough to convict Victoria without proof of the poisoning. Nevertheless, with these files, at least she could expose her true nature to the authorities. She quickly put the file in her bag and left the office, her heart pounding. There was still Daniel's office to check, and Aurora was convinced she would find more evidence of the financial conspiracy the siblings had orchestrated while Richard lay defenseless. With the same caution, she approached Daniel's office, which she also opened with the key Peter had given her. The interior was far more austere than Victoria's, stacks of papers and legal books piled everywhere. Unlike Victoria's meticulous order, Daniel seemed to be a controlled chaos. Aurora began combing through the folders and documents on the desk, looking for anything that might incriminate the siblings. What she found made a chill run down her spine. Contracts signed by Richard, handing control of his businesses over to Victoria. The signatures were recent, but Aurora knew Richard had been too sick to even hold a pen in recent weeks. That could only mean one thing: his signatures had been forged. She also found numerous records of money transfers to unknown accounts, all linked to Victoria and Daniel. The funds Richard had worked so hard to earn were disappearing, siphoned off by a carefully laid plan to bankrupt him and leave Victoria the sole heir of whatever was left. The proof was there before her eyes. Victoria and Daniel had been manipulating Richard's businesses since he became ill. Not only did they want his life, but they also wanted to destroy his legacy, everything he had built. Aurora snapped a few quick photos of the documents with her phone, aware she had to act fast before someone found her. She stashed the evidence in her bag and hurried out of the office, her heart pounding with both fury and sadness. She now had all she needed: Victoria's dark past, the forged contracts, and the financial records showing their betrayal. All that remained was the final proof of the poisoning. Returning to her room, Aurora felt she had taken a crucial step towards saving her son. But the weight of what she had uncovered also pressed down on her. How could someone be so cruel? How could the person who promised to love and care for Richard be behind such a monstrous act? The following day, Aurora met with Sarah in secret. The nurse gave her the samples of the medications she had collected in recent days. Aurora stored them carefully, knowing a trusted doctor would analyze them. If her suspicions were confirmed and the medication was indeed tainted, they would have the definitive proof to take to the authorities. "How long do you think it will take to get the results?" Aurora asked, tense. Sarah sighed, obviously worn down by the stress of the last few days. "I hope in a couple of days. But we have to be careful. Victoria is starting to suspect. If she realizes we're planning something, she might act before we have the proof." Aurora nodded, feeling that time was their greatest enemy. Every day that passed was another day Richard remained in danger. But she also knew they couldn't rush things. The only way to defeat Victoria was to be as meticulous as she had been in her plan to destroy Richard. Sarah promised to continue keeping Richard as stable as possible, though it was getting harder every day. The situation grew more desperate as time went on, but both women knew they couldn't give up. Aurora returned to her room that night, weighed down by the evidence she'd collected and by the fear that Victoria would discover what they were doing. She knew a confrontation was inevitable. When that moment came, she would need all the courage and strength she had left to face such a dangerous and calculating woman as Victoria. She looked out the window at the city lights flickering in the distance, wondering how many other lives Victoria had destroyed with her unbridled ambition. But one thing was certain for Aurora: her son would not be the next victim. With renewed determination, Aurora braced herself mentally for the steps ahead. The days dragged on in the mansion, every hour feeling like the clock was working against them. Aurora knew the situation was growing more dire with each passing day that Richard remained under Victoria and Daniel's control. Yet now they had an advantage. The evidence was coming, and Richard's poisoning was about to be exposed. But something else worried Aurora deeply. Even if they got the proof, Richard was still a prisoner in his own home. Victoria rarely left the mansion these days, making it difficult for anyone to approach Richard. Her every move was cold and calculated, and Aurora couldn't shake the feeling that Victoria was starting to suspect something. Fate soon gave her the opportunity she needed. One morning, Peter informed her that Victoria and Daniel had an important meeting out of town, and they would be gone for most of the day. This was the moment Aurora, Sarah, and Peter had been waiting for. The escape plan had to be executed now, while Victoria and Daniel were away. Any delay could be fatal. They knew they couldn't just walk Richard out of the mansion without being stopped. They had carefully devised a plan. It was barely dawn when Victoria and Daniel left. Ever efficient and discreet, Peter confirmed that the guards at the gate and the security cameras had been temporarily disabled, thanks to a small malfunction he had orchestrated. Time was on their side, but they also knew any slip-up could cost them dearly. Sarah was in Richard's room, getting him ready for the transfer. Although weak and barely conscious, Richard seemed to sense something important was about to happen. His eyes, dulled by illness, moved slowly, trying to understand what was happening around him. Aurora entered the room quietly and stopped upon seeing her son in that condition. She hadn't been able to visit him for weeks, and now, having him before her eyes, she couldn't hold back her tears. The man who had been her pride, her strong, determined son, now lay in bed like a shadow of himself. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and his body had become so thin that he looked frail, vulnerable. Seeing him like that broke her heart into 1,000 pieces, but it also ignited a strength she didn't know she had. She wouldn't let Richard die in that place. "Richard, my son," she whispered, approaching the bed and gently stroking his hand. "I'm here. I'm here to get you out of this." Richard slowly turned his head toward her. Though he couldn't speak a word, Aurora saw a glimmer of recognition in his eyes. Deep down, he was still fighting, even though his body was weakened by months of poisoning. Sarah came closer, careful. "We have to move him now, before Victoria returns," she said quietly. I've arranged for an ambulance. It will take him to a private clinic where he'll be safe." Aurora nodded, wiping away her tears quickly. She knew this wasn't the time to break down. Together, Sarah and Aurora helped Richard sit up as gently as possible. His body could barely support itself, and each tiny movement seemed to cause him pain. But there was no choice. They had to move him before it was too late. Peter appeared at the door with a wheelchair, and with great care, they placed Richard in it. The mansion's silence was absolute, but every little noise, from the squeak of the wheels to the rustle of sheets, seemed magnified in the empty corridors. Any sound could alert someone, and they couldn't risk being discovered. Their journey through the mansion's hallways was tense. Every shadow, every corner felt like an impending threat. As they headed toward the rear exit where the ambulance waited, Aurora couldn't stop imagining the fallout if Victoria or Daniel returned early. Her heart pounded, and the sense of urgency grew with every step. Finally, they reached the back door. The ambulance was there, just as Sarah had promised, with a driver she'd hired, someone trustworthy who would make sure they reached the clinic without incident. They carefully lifted Richard onto a stretcher and placed him in the vehicle. Only then did Aurora allow herself a brief moment of relief as the ambulance doors closed and they sped away from the mansion. Sarah sat beside her, monitoring Richard closely while the vehicle moved swiftly toward the clinic. Though the immediate danger had passed, the risk remained. Aurora knew Victoria and Daniel would soon discover Richard was missing, and when they did, they would react with fury. As the ambulance drove off, Aurora glanced out the window, watching as the mansion grew smaller in the distance. Part of her felt relief to see the place that had caused her sons so much harm fade behind them, but another part, the rational one, knew the real battle was about to begin. Rescuing Richard from the mansion was only the first step. The private clinic they arrived at was small, discreet, and far from the city's hustle and bustle. Sarah had chosen it carefully, ensuring Richard could receive medical attention without interference from Victoria or Daniel. As soon as they arrived, a medical team, already briefed on the situation, took charge of Richard, rushing him to a room to begin treatment. Aurora stayed in the waiting area, sitting in an uncomfortable plastic chair while Sarah and the doctors worked in the next room. She knew they were doing everything they could to save him, but the wait was unbearable. Each minute without news of her son tore at her heart. After what seemed like hours, Sarah emerged from Richard's room, her face a mixture of relief and caution. "He's stable for now," she said in a reassuring tone. "The doctors believe we can reverse some of the damage he's suffered, but it's going to be a long and complicated process. The important thing is that he's in a safe place now." Aurora let out a breath she'd been holding in all day. Though her son was still fighting for his life, at least he was out of Victoria and Daniel's control. She knew Richard wasn't out of danger, but at least he had a chance to recover. "What do we do now?" Aurora asked, looking at Sarah with uncertain eyes. "Now we wait for the test results on the medication," Sarah replied. "If we confirm Richard was poisoned, we can take the case to the authorities. The documents you have on the financial maneuvers will also be crucial. Victoria and Daniel won't get away with this." Aurora nodded, though she knew that moment was still far off. There was so much yet to be done, and the threat from Victoria remained. They wouldn't just stand by after discovering Richard had been taken. But for now, Aurora allowed herself a moment of peace. Her son was safe, if only temporarily. That was more than she'd had in weeks. With her face haggard but filled with determination, she sat in the waiting room, knowing the battle was far from over. At least they had taken an important step toward Richard's freedom. The silence in the clinic was different from the mansion's. Here there were no lurking shadows or dark secrets, only hope. The sun was just beginning to set when Victoria and Daniel arrived at the mansion. Tension filled the vehicle's interior. They'd had an important meeting, but their minds weren't completely on business. Victoria had noticed small changes in the house in recent days. Something in the air unsettled her. Though she couldn't pinpoint it exactly, she felt things were no longer under her complete control. When they reached the main entrance, something immediately caught their attention, Security seemed lax. Victoria frowned as she got out of the car and walked quickly to the door. Daniel, who was always more methodical and cautious, followed with firm steps. The mansion seemed calm, but the absolute silence that once comforted her now felt ominous. Upon entering, they were greeted by the butler, Peter, as usual. Yet Victoria noticed something different in his gaze, almost imperceptible, but she knew how to read people. Peter seemed ill at ease. She fixed him with a stare that lasted a second too long, but said nothing. Deep inside, her suspicion grew rapidly. "Is everything all right, Peter?" she asked, her voice quiet but loaded with authority. "Everything as usual, ma'am," he replied, avoiding eye contact, which only intensified Victoria's suspicions. Still, she decided not to press him for now. Over the years, she had learned to trust her instincts, and right now, they told her something had changed. She exchanged a glance with Daniel, who, though not sharing her sense of urgency, offered a brief nod as if understanding her thoughts. Without a word, they began walking toward the wing where Richard had been confined. Meanwhile, at the clinic, Aurora anxiously watched the clock. Sarah had insisted she needed to rest after the day's tension, but the mother couldn't stop thinking about the moment Victoria and Daniel discovered Richard's disappearance. She knew that moment was coming. Soon, the silence in the mansion would be replaced by a storm of fury. Her phone vibrated. Sarah's lawyer friend was on the other end, his voice tense. "There's a problem. Victoria and Daniel have filed a complaint against you. They're alleging that Richard was kidnapped by his mother and that this is all part of a plan to take back control of his businesses." Aurora felt the ground crumble beneath her. "How is that possible?" she asked, her voice quavering with outrage. "Richard is fighting for his life." "I know," said the lawyer, "but it looks like they're pulling strings behind the scenes. They're trying to discredit you too before you can file any charges. You must act now." Aurora turned to Sarah, knowing the legal battle ahead would be even harder than they'd imagined. But she also knew they couldn't stop. Richard's well-being, his life, was at stake, and she couldn't let Victoria win this time. "Let's go," she said with renewed resolve. "We'll fight with everything we have." At the courthouse, the legal battle began intensely. Victoria, with her customary elegance, presented herself before the judge as a concerned wife worried about her husband's well-being. She alleged that Aurora and Sarah had kidnapped him, preventing him from receiving proper medical treatment in order to seize control of his fortune. But when Aurora presented proof of Richard's poisoning along with financial documents showing how the siblings had manipulated his business dealings for months, the courtroom fell silent. Victoria tried to maintain her composure, but as lawyers and witnesses delivered evidence of her treachery, her face began to crumble. After reviewing the proof, the judge wasted no time in grasping the real situation. Richard hadn't been kidnapped. He had been rescued from the clutches of a wife who'd slowly tried to murder him to seize his fortune. Victoria and Daniel, the judge declared, are guilty of attempted murder and financial fraud. The sentence fell like a mortal blow. Victoria, who had manipulated everything around her for years, watched her empire collapse in a matter of minutes. Security officers escorted her out of the courtroom while Aurora, relieved but exhausted, sank into a chair, feeling that justice had finally prevailed. The days following the trial were a mix of relief and reflection for Aurora. After Victoria and Daniel's sentencing, life began to adopt a calmer rhythm, though both she and Richard had a long road of healing ahead. A warm summer breeze blew over the countryside where Aurora had spent most of her life, and where she now found herself again, this time with her son, who was slowly recovering in the tranquility of their rural surroundings. Richard had been transferred from the clinic to a small rural house rented near Aurora's home, where he received constant medical attention but was spared the painful memories of the mansion. Though still fragile, he had shown clear signs of improvement over the past few weeks. His strength was gradually returning, and although recovery would be a lengthy process, he was alive, safe, and surrounded by his mother's love. Aurora sat on the porch of the small house, gazing at the horizon as the sun slowly descended. the sky filled with warm colors and birdsong. So much had happened in recent months that she could hardly believe it was finally over. She recalled each moment of anguish, every tear shed at her son's bedside. Now, here they were, with Richard safe and Victoria and Daniel facing the consequences of their actions. A short while later, Sarah arrived, smiling with that combination of exhaustion and satisfaction that was so characteristic of her. She had chosen to continue as Richard's nurse during his recovery, and over time, she had become close friends with Aurora. They had shared a journey of struggle and sacrifice, forging a bond of solidarity that could never be broken. "I saw him doing a bit better today," Sarah said, sitting next to Aurora. "He's regaining mobility in his legs, and the doctors think he might start walking again soon. It will be slow, but it's progress." Aurora smiled. Every small improvement felt like an immense gift. "Thank you, Sarah. I don't know how I would have done this without you," she said, her voice brimming with gratitude. Sarah returned the smile, though her eyes reflected something deeper. "I didn't do it only for Richard. You've been incredible, Aurora. Your love and determination saved your son. You never gave up even when everything seemed lost." Aurora looked toward the horizon, letting Sarah's words wash over her. She didn't see herself as a hero, but she knew she had fought with everything she had. Deep down, it was the love of a mother that had propelled her onward, that had given her the strength to confront Victoria despite all the challenges. Later, Aurora went inside the house and walked straight to Richard's room. He was sitting up in bed, propped by pillows, his eyes closed. But upon sensing his mother, he opened his eyes slowly and smiled. "Mom," he murmured, his voice soft but clear. Aurora approached and sat by his side, taking his hand in hers. Its warmth reassured her, a constant reminder that he was still there with her. "You're improving every day, my son," she said tenderly. "Soon, you'll be running through the fields again, like when you were a boy." Richard let out a small laugh, though Aurora could see the effort it cost him. "Maybe I won't run as fast as before," he said, "but I hope to be back on my feet soon." They sat in silence for a moment, content just to be together. Words were no longer as necessary as they once were. Simply being side by side after everything that had happened was enough. "I want you to know something, Mom," Richard said suddenly, his voice stronger now. "Throughout this time, even though I couldn't talk or move, I felt you. I knew you were close by, even when I was in the mansion. That's what kept me fighting, even when it seemed all was lost." Aurora felt tears welling in her eyes as she squeezed his hand more tightly, trying to hold back the emotions surging within her. "I'll always be with you, Richard," she said, her voice breaking with emotion. "Always." With time, life took on a new equilibrium. Richard gradually recovered more mobility thanks to physical therapy and the ongoing support from Sarah and the medical team. It wasn't easy, but each little step was a victory for both him and Aurora, who watched her son reclaim the strength and determination that once defined him. Meanwhile, Victoria and Daniel served prison sentences for their crimes. The trial had been a catharsis for Aurora. Though she remained filled with sorrow for what her son had endured, she could finally see justice served. The empire Victoria had tried to build on lies and betrayal collapsed. Though the damage to Richard couldn't be undone, at least he was out of danger now. Aurora ultimately decided to move back to her old house in the countryside, a place that had always been her refuge. Richard stayed nearby, continuing his recovery in a small rented home near Aurora's. The bond between mother and son grew stronger through everything they had endured, and both knew that while the journey had been hard, the most important thing was that they had faced it together. Months later, on a peaceful afternoon, Aurora and Richard decided to walk through the surrounding fields. Though Richard still needed help to walk long distances, he felt stronger each day. The clear blue sky stretched above them as they walked slowly, recalling the times Richard had run free through the same fields as a boy. "This place gives me peace," Richard said as he looked over the landscape. "It's like every time I'm here, everything we went through is left behind." Aurora smiled, feeling the same solace. This is where you will always find your home, son. No matter how far you go, it will always be your refuge. Richard gazed at her, returning the smile. He knew that whatever might happen in the future, he would always have his mother's support. That was the true treasure, something neither Victoria nor Daniel could ever take from him. The sun began to sink below the horizon, and mother and son kept walking together, carrying the promise of a future filled with peace after conquering the darkness. Life had changed, but the love and strength they shared would always bind them. Thank you for listening to the story to the end. Write your thoughts about it in the comments. Subscribe to the channel Tell Me and share this video with your friends and loved ones. This motivates us to continue working on new stories every day. Do not miss the next amazing story that is about to appear on your screen. We are very grateful to you for being with us. In the description under this video you can open the catalog of all the stories. See you there.